Before I even get into today's video, I'd like you to know that a majority of this version of Resident Evil is the same as the original release. So if you haven't seen my video on the original release of Resident Evil, there's a link in the description down below for you to check out if you haven't watched it before. So I would recommend checking that video out first before watching this one, if that's the case. However, if you've already watched that video, then you're pretty much good. You can stick around and continue to watch this video. So right away, I do want to address the elephant in the room when it comes to this version of the game, and that's the soundtrack. It's practically the one thing that everyone bashes for being one of the worst soundtracks ever made. And believe it or not, I do want to play a little bit of devil's advocate here and say that the game soundtrack isn't the worst thing. There are some tracks that I did find to be somewhat enjoyable or somewhat decent. Yes, I know that there's the awful basement theme that everyone points to for being the absolute worst soundtrack in the game, and I honestly agree, the original is absolutely superior in every way. However, there are a few tracks that do well on their own, and I don't feel like they are bad in any way. For example, I think that the save room theme, the theme that plays when you first encounter Rebecca, and also the theme when Wesker disappears are not bad. At least in my opinion, I just did not feel like they were bad. And I do want to stress the fact that I do think that the original soundtrack is superior in every way, especially since the director's cut soundtrack is credited to a fraud. However, there is a few tolerable tracks here and there that I did not mind. That said, I think I am talking a little bit too much about this, so let's get into some of the other things about this version of Resident Evil 1. Aside from what I had already mentioned, the only notable thing in this version of Resident Evil 1 is the new game modes and the DualShock controller support. So I'd like to talk about the game modes just a little bit. Beginner mode is like original mode, but there are some minor differences. It mostly boils down to some balance changes where the player has more health and deals more damage to enemies. There's also double the amounts of items you can find throughout the mansion. Original mode is as the name implies, with the exception of the soundtrack as mentioned earlier. Lastly, there's arranged mode, which is the most significantly changed of the three game modes. You start the game off with an alternate costume. The handgun is replaced with the Beretta Custom, which is essentially a prototype to the Samurai Edge found in later games. There's new enemy and item placement to throw off players familiar with the placements from the original game. And there's hyper zombies, which are just a faster zombie. Other than that, the game is practically the same. It plays exactly the same way with the addition of dual analog controller support. And that might partially be a selling point to some people, and I did mention this in the previous episode, that some people might prefer playing with an analog stick over a D-pad when it comes to fixed camera angle tank controlled Resident Evils. So this version might be better suited for those particular people. So you might be wondering why even bother doing a video on this version of Resident Evil 1 since it's more or less the same game minus the few new additions or changes. Well, there's two reasons. First, I wanted to have a video that would keep anyone subscribed to the channel waiting for Resident Evil 2 and 3 videos to be held over by a smaller one, hence why it's episode 1.5 in the title. Second, unlike the universal opinion that people give on this version of the game in that it should be skipped, I'd like to present a difference of opinion. Now, with that all said, is the Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock version worth going back to? Yes and no for different reasons. So for some, this is going to be an indefinite no, especially considering that there are other versions of the original Resident Evil that feature more noteworthy content. However, if you just prefer to own the original digitally or would prefer to play the game that has dual analog controller support, this isn't a bad way to get into the original game. Yeah, you wouldn't be getting the original soundtrack, but that's not really going to make a huge impact on the gameplay experience. In the end, it just comes down to preference and personal choice. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video. I know it's taken me far longer than originally planned, but hopefully I can finish what I started 2 years ago. Damn, it's really been that long. I really should focus on finishing this project then. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for sticking around, and I'll see you all in the next one.